Welcome to Study Session 2, History and Development of Clinical Psychology. Introduction. Having discussed the definitions and scope of clinical psychology, this study session will therefore discuss how clinical psychology emerged to play an important role in the area of human adjustment. While part of this emergence is due to the society's increased interest in mental health and adjustment in recent years, a substantial part rests also on the contributions made by psychologists and on the potential services they are seen as capable of providing. Thus, the growth and history of clinical psychology has followed several traditions, namely experimental research tradition, measurement of individual differences, the development of the related profession of psychiatry, and the influence of the humanitarian movement, which you will study. You will also learn about the development of contemporary clinical psychology. Learning outcomes for study session. At the end of this study, you should be able to 1. Discuss the history of clinical psychology, 2. Discuss the development of contemporary clinical psychology. History of clinical psychology. Clinical psychology can be traced to several traditions, which include experimental research, measurement of individual differences, and the impact of psychiatry and the humanitarian movement. The legacy of experimental research. The academic and laboratory beginnings of psychology are themselves not much older than the professional beginnings of clinical psychology. Over 130 years ago, Wilhelm Wundt, 1832 to 1920, founded the first psychological laboratory in 1879 in Leipzig, helping psychology gain recognition as an independent science. Observations and experimentation, still among the major sources of data in psychology, stem from Wundt's early work. Wundt rigidly and systematically can be considered the first modern psychologist, founder of the first psychology laboratory, editor of the first psychology journal, synthesizer of research findings, classifier of seemingly diverse data, quantifier and pursuer of laws pertaining to the human mind. History of clinical psychology. Wundt's definitions of psychology's content and methods continue to influence modern psychologists for even today. Clinical psychologists, like all other psychologists, are taught to emulate the experimenter who, with a detached and an objective attitude, carried out carefully controlled, rigorous experiments while searching for verifiable laws of human behavior. Ivan Pavlov, 1849 to 1936, the Russian psychologist, has also enormously influenced clinical psychology. Pavlov studied the connection between behavior and environmental stimuli. He began investigating conditioned reflexes in dogs in 1899, demonstrating how learning by conditioning could take place if a bell or a tuning fork rang when food was presented. By repeating this procedure, the dog ultimately learned to respond by salivating to the bell or tuning fork alone. Pavlov's greatest contribution was to demonstrate with a simple, objective experimental technique that complex behavior could be analyzed and controlled in a laboratory. Pavlov was also interested in abnormal behavior, in the animal's behavior, and during the last decade of his life, he designed a series of experiments in which he produced an experimental neurosis in an animal. Thus, his work, along with American psychologist Edward Lee Thorndike's studies, inspired many later psychologists to pursue the objective description and analysis of behavior. The recent revival of interest in developing behavior modification programs for changing or eliminating undesirable or maladaptive behavior stems from Pavlov's and Thorndike's early work, Measurement of Individual Differences. Charles Darwin, 1809 to 1882, naturalist and biologist, created a scientific revolution with his theory of evolution by natural selection. Among his major contributions, especially relevant to future scientists, was the careful, painstaking way he collected and organized the large-scale detailed record of evidence to support his hypothesis. Darwin's work particularly influenced the emerging field of psychology, which it seemed was striving to become an exact quantitative science. Darwin helped shape psychology in the direction of biology generally. More specifically, he influenced psychologists to understand mental processes in terms of their function in an organism's adaptation to the world. Darwin's work particularly influenced the emerging field of psychology, which it seemed was striving to become an exact quantitative science. Darwin helped shape psychology in the direction of biologists generally. More specifically, he influenced the psychologists to understand mental processes in terms of their functions in an organism's adaptation to the world. Darwin began studies in child psychology, for example, infant development and language development, as well as studies of group behavior. Beck and Molish, 1959, even suggested that Darwin's work be credited as representing the beginning of scientific clinical psychology. Darwin's emphasis on individual variation stimulated his cousin, Sir Francis Galton, 1822 to 1911, to study individual variations in men, particularly differences in hereditary makeup. Galton set out to prove that eminence runs in families with a frequency that could not be explained on an environmental basis. He first collected data on the family trees of eminent scientists, jurists, authors, and others in order to show that genius was inherited. He first collected data on the family trees of eminent scientists, jurists, authors, and others in order to show that genius was inherited. Galton's inventiveness contributed a great deal to modern clinical psychology, and among those contributions were the focus on the individual, the development of quantitative mental measurements. 3. The statistical analysis of psychological data. The invention of the mental tests such as the World Association test, the first experimental attempt to study and measure an individual's associated thoughts. The development of the questionnaire method. The use of free association method to demonstrate the significance of childhood memories on adult life. The impact of psychiatry. Aberrant, bizarre, and disordered behavior has characterized certain individuals since the beginning of recorded history. Until the 16th century, insanity continued to be explained as the work of demons and witches, and behaviorally disordered individuals were kept in monasteries or prisons. Slowly, a more enlightened attitude emerged and hospitals or asylums were established. However, these early asylums were little more than penal institutions into which the insane were herded and treated in a most humane manner. For instance, Overbrook Insane Asylum, New Jersey, is one of the asylums where patients are being treated in an inhumane manner. Towards the end of the 18th century, Philippe Pinel, 1745 to 1826, the French physician and reformer, who has been called the father of scientific psychiatry, and Benjamin Rush, 1745 to 1813, the first American psychiatrist, began to make an impact on the medical thinking and psychiatric thought of their time. Thus, Pinel became in charge of the large Parisian asylum and tried to make psychiatry more scientific by keeping more accurate hospital records, taking case histories on inmates, and attempting some classification system of mental illness. Like Pinel, Rush took a humane view of the mentally ill. His efforts at scientific systemization of psychiatry resulted in his 1812 treatise, Medical Inquiries and Diseases of the Mind, the first and only American textbook on mental illness for the next 70 years. Apart from Pinel and Rush, Emil Kraepelin, 1855 to 1926, a German psychiatrist, spent years gathering thousands of case histories from which he developed his classification of mental illnesses by symptomatology as well as the cause. Certain mental diseases like dementia, precox, known as schizophrenia, were believed by Kraepelin to be incurable. Kraepelin's classification systems and work on attitudes of clinical psychologists and psychiatrists for many years to come regarding treatment of individuals were classified as schizophrenic. Another authority in psychiatry whose influence helped shape the history of clinical psychology was Sigmund Freud, 1859 to 1939, who trained in neurology. He used hypnosis on hysterical patients, but found out that the technique did not produce the permanent relief of symptoms he was seeking. Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, is also identified with the importance of unconscious, instinctual forces in human behavior, transformed psychiatry from a relatively static and descriptive branch of medicine to a vital force concerned with uncovering the causes of human suffering. His psychoanalytic treatment provided the first comprehensive psychological set of therapeutic procedures for relieving such suffering. The humanitarian movement. You will be acquainted with three key persons as regards the humanitarian movement, viz. William Tuke, 1732 to 1822, Dorothea Dix, 1802 to 1887, and Clifford Beers, 1876 to 1943. William Tuke was an English tea merchant who became so horrified at the conditions in the asylums he visited that he induced the Society of Friends, of which he was a member, to establish a retreat under the guidance at York in the English countryside. Rather than operating as a prison, the York retreat provided a simple, tranquil, Quaker atmosphere where patients were given good food, exercise, and recreation and were treated with respect and dignity. Thus, Tuke and his small group of Quakers also influenced the public to develop a more enlightened attitude towards mental illness, including the belief that such illness was ultimately curable. The most celebrated and certainly the most effective reformer in the United States was Dorothea Dix, a New England school teacher. While she was teaching Sunday school to female prisoners, she became aware that mentally ill patients were often housed with criminals, and both were treated brutally. Because of her constant visits to every jail and almshouse in Massachusetts, she mounted campaigns for the release of these persons and thus created greater public awareness of the need for humane and adequate treatment and facilities for criminals. One more recent influence has been the development of the mental hygiene movement. The term mental hygiene refers to the promotion of mental health and the prevention of mental illness. This movement was founded by Clifford Beers and came about as a result of Beers' book, A Mind That Found Itself, 1908, an account of his experiences as a patient in various mental hospitals. Beers experienced several breakdowns after graduating from Yale and was hospitalized in private sanatoriums and state hospitals in Connecticut, receiving the then prevailing treatment of restraints and isolation. Upon his eventual release, after several years of hospitalization, Beers was determined to inform the public how it felt to be mentally ill and to arouse a movement to reform existing evils in hospital treatment programs. Beers' books, as Bloomberg 1950 notes, proved to be the shot heard round the world, the catalyst that finally forced an indifferent public to become aware of some of the problems of mental illness and to demand changes in patient care. The development of contemporary clinical psychology. The contemporary clinical psychologists were mainly working in settings where their services were highly needed. They worked in places such as hospitals, schools, geriatric homes, schools for the handicapped, etc. And they were also engaged in teaching, research, assessment, therapy, and administration. To have a better understanding, you will have to visit a contemporary psychological clinic and see how it took its root from various generations. The first generation. The history of clinical psychology began in the 1900s, when the first generation of clinical psychologists developed. In the 1890s, the following events paved the way for this development. 1. William James published his Principles of Psychology, 1890, considered a major source of ideas reaching into all realms of pure and applied psychology. 2. Sigmund Freud published an early paper on hysteria, thus introducing the psychodynamic approach to understanding and treating abnormal behavior. 3. Leitner Whitner, a student of Wundt, founded the first psychological clinic in the United States at the University of Pennsylvania in 1896. 4. A small group of about 30 psychologists, at the invitation of G. Stanley Hall, met at Clark University to found the American Psychological Association in 1892. The early psychologists functioned primarily in academic settings. It is no coincidence that Whitner's early efforts to develop what he called a clinical method in psychology emerged from the psychological laboratory of a university. Whitmer, in short, was more interested in clinically applying the developing methods of psychological laboratories to individual problems. According to Thomas, 2009, Leitner, even though he was known as the father of clinical psychology, his name may have been historically forgotten, evidenced by lack of posting of his obituary in the American Psychological Association's website among the great psychologists of his time. Some other psychologists were also becoming interested in the study of the individual. They tried to develop tests to measure individual differences in ability, such as intelligence. Cattell, 1860 to 1944, an American combining experimental psychology and individual differences, introduced the first battery of psychological tests in the United States in 1894, when he attempted to appraise the mental abilities of incoming freshmen at Columbia University. A more successful attempt to develop psychological tests of intelligence, soon to become an important impetus for the growth of clinical psychology, came from the work of Alfred Binet, 1859 to 1911. Binet and Theodore Simon, a physician, sought a more objective, practical, diagnostic method for measuring the degree of intellectual deficiency. The result was the 1905 Binet-Simon scale, including 30 tasks of increasing degrees of complexity that will provide a crude means of differentiating normal and mentally deficient children. Psychological testing was just the impetus clinical psychology needed to grow and to gain public acceptance. Psychologists began to use the Stanford Binet and similar tests of intelligence and other functions in a variety of clinical situations, and so did schools, children's homes, juvenile courts, reformatories, and prisons. The first child guidance clinic was founded in Chicago in 1909. It was meant for delinquent children. The clinic was originally named the Juvenile Psychopathic Institute, now as the Institute for Juvenile Research. At first, it had a psychiatrist, William Healy, as a director, and later a social worker, Grace Fennell. The second generation. During the second generation, the emergence of clinical psychology expanded when internship training was instituted in mental hospitals and training schools were established for the mentally retarded in an effort to supplement the academic coursework of psychology students. During the World War I, when the United States entered the war, the sudden influx of army recruits necessitated development of some methods to group and classify them according to their abilities. Thus came the boom period for clinical psychologists, since various tests of intelligence, achievement, and vocational aptitudes were developed and used in schools, industries, prisons, mental hospitals, and the new child guidance clinics. During the 1930s, clinical psychology started leaving the areas of measuring intellectual ability and school achievement in children. Thus, psychologists expanded into diagnostic work with adults, usually in mental hospitals. In addition, psychological testing itself was expanding, augmented by the introduction of personality tests. The Rorschach in-blood test, named after originator a Swiss psychiatrist, Hermann Rorschach, was introduced after World War I. The third generation. World War II and its aftermath were the years of perhaps the greatest growth to date for clinical psychology. During the war itself, 1,000 psychologists served in the armed forces, making significant contribution to such applied problems as selection, evaluation, and job placement of draftees, morale maintenance, and studying human factors in equipment design. These psychologists also involved themselves in the treatment of a large number of mental patients in army hospitals. The third generation clinical psychologists differed from their predecessors in many ways. They were better trained as practitioners in diagnosis, psychotherapy, and research than any previous group of psychologists because of the enormous government undertaking in establishing training programs. The present generation. The present generation, that is, the fourth generation of clinical psychologists, engaged in 4 sets of activities. These activities are diagnosis and assessment, clinical research, psychotherapy, and community consultation. The diagnosis of psychopathology has given way for many clinicians to the assessment of an individual's psychological strength as well as his weaknesses. From the foregoing, you have seen that the history of clinical psychology started from the United States of America, but you will now be acquainted with the development of clinical psychology in Nigeria. The birth of clinical psychology in Nigeria started under the auspices of Professors Alfred Awaritefe of the Department of Mental Health, University of Benin, Z.A.F. Uzuka of the Department of Psychology, University of Lagos, I.O. Dada of the Psychiatric Hospital, Yaba, Lagos, and H.I. Amatu of the Psychiatric Hospital, Bauchi. They pioneered the emergence and birth of Nigerian Association of Clinical Psychologists in 1979. The journal published by this association is known as Nigerian Journal of Clinical Psychology. Though the development of clinical psychology in Nigeria is still in its infancy, it has gained a little more recognition in hospital settings as was previously the case. It is not uncommon, therefore, to find a department or unit of clinical psychology in teaching hospitals and some federal medical centers in Nigeria, though some of these units are grossly understaffed. The future prospects are, however, bright for clinical psychology as a discipline in Nigeria. Psycho-oncology practice, which is a subspecialty of clinical psycho-oncology, has been evolved in the University College Hospital, Ibadan. A unit of psycho-oncology has been created in the Department of Radiotherapy, Faculty of Clinical Sciences, College of Medicine, University of Ibadan. Summary of study session. In study session 2, you have learned that 1. Observations and experimentations still among the major. Take 2. 1. Observations and experimentation still among the major sources of data in psychology stem from Wundt's early work. 2. Charles Darwin, 1809 to 1882, naturalist and biologist, created a scientific revolution with his theory of evolution by natural selection. 3. The history of clinical psychology began in the early 1900s when the first generation of clinical psychologists developed. 4. During the 1930s, clinical psychology started leaving the areas of measuring intellectual ability and school achievement in children. This is the end of study session 2. Thanks for listening.